my second shot, I felt bad for 24 hours. But after that, I felt totally fine.
Hello.
Go ahead,
Thank you everyone for coming. We're so happy to once again welcome Dr. Shayna Weiss back to Skokie Valley. As she mentioned last time, she is a daughter of the area and is the Associate Director for Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. Before that, was a visiting scholar at the Naval Academy, and taught as a postdoc research fellow at both Tel Aviv and New York, and also at Bar Ilan University, and is going to be talking tonight about gender segregation. And I believe you're working on a book on gender segregation in Israel. So maybe we'll have you back for the book tour, and whenever that comes out. So we're so happy. Thank you for joining us again.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. I am going to share my screen and get started. Okay, let me just print one second. Okay, great. So as Mike said, today I'm going to be talking about gender segregation in Israel, but I'm going to do it by focusing on a really specific part of the story, and actually a failed case of gender segregation, or I should say an attempt at gender segregation. And I'm going to do that by talking about the first public swimming pool in Jerusalem. The plan was announced in 1957 when a man, actually an American-born man named Gershon Agron, was the mayor. It was extremely controversial. There were tons of protests. We'll get to it, but there were even protests at the White House in America against this pool. And no matter what, despite all of this, and despite the huge amount of controversy, this pool eventually opens in 1958. And it exists, maybe some of you have been, off of Emek Rephaim until it closes in 2017. So I'm interested in the story of this pool, what it says about Jerusalem, and what it says about gender in Israel and ultra-Orthodoxy today. And I want to, first we have to think about, why was this so controversial? I was once speaking about this pool, and it was in an international audience. And afterwards, one of the people came up to me. It was an international workshop on space and conflict. And this woman was from Cyprus. And she said to me, it's so unfortunate they made these ultra-Orthodox Jews swim in the pool. And I was like, wait, no, that's not what happened, right? No one had to go here. It was the very idea of the pool, which was what was controversial. And, often when we talk about religion in Israel or ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, we have this idea of religion and state and politics as these separate things that, are completely separate entities. And I want to argue tonight that that's actually not quite what's going on. I'm following the approach of an academic named Yaakov Yadgar, really interesting person, who talks about that for what we think of as a secular Zionist state, there is actually quite an insistence on Jewish values in the public sphere, right? And in this formulation, in this way of thinking, Orthodox Jewish ways of understanding, whether it be, for example, control over marriage or observance of Shabbat in the public sphere, is really important for the state to sort of feel Jewish and to passively enable Jewish observance, right? And this is, of course, clear if any of you have been to Israel, especially on a holiday. You feel Shabbat, right? You feel the holidays, and it creates a space that sort of feels Jewish. And this is especially important because when we look at halakha, we look at Jewish law, as I'm sure most of you know, there's no real difference, let's say, between individual observance and communal observance of Jewish law. So for example, a person driving their own private car in Israel, a person driving their own private car on Shabbat, that's just as forbidden as a state-run bus, right, with a Jewish driver driving people around on Shabbat. But only one of those is not allowed, right, in the state of Israel, and it's that public bus. And when we think about Yaakov Yadgar's idea of the public sphere feeling Jewish and this idea of passive observance, it makes a lot more sense. I'll talk about that more a bit during the Q&A if you want, but that's one of the approaches that I am thinking about. So I spoke a little bit about this last week, but I want to reiterate, right? When we talk about Orthodox Jews, when we talk about these groups of people, and especially Haredi Jews, right? It's an umbrella category. It covers a lot of different kinds of people. We're talking about some of those subgroups today. And last time when we focused really on, I would say, approaches to secular culture and modernity, today I want to focus on approaches to Zionism and the state, right? You may have heard that ultra-Orthodox Jews, especially in Israel, are anti-Zionist, right? And we will talk about some of those more extreme anti-Zionists today, but the vast majority of Orthodox Jews in Israel, even in the 50s and 60s, were what I would call a Zionist or accommodationist. Maybe this wasn't their preferred form of government, right? Maybe they didn't love that secular Jews weren't in charge. They preferred some idea of a state where halakha was important, but they were willing to work with the system to get what they needed. And that's what really interests me, because it's this claim to be in the system, but not sort of the system. And I think it's an interesting contradiction that we can think about. So what's at stake when we think about this pool? I want to argue that three things are at stake, and then we'll go more into the sort of the story of it. The first one is methods, right? And a question of how we look at failure, right? Of course, every failure is also a success, right? Depends on what perspective that you have. But what's interesting to me about this failed fight is that I actually think it sets precedents for the future, right? In the 1950s and the 1960s, everyone, not just ultra-Orthodox Jews, are learning about this new reality of the Israeli state. It's a new country. There aren't rules. Yes, there are precedents set from the pre-state period of what this might look like, but it's not entirely clear how these realities are going to shake out. And everyone, all groups, but especially ultra-Orthodox groups, are figuring out what this means for them and their identities. My second point is about red lines and engagement. During this controversy about the pool, there's going to be questions about who can your allies be. For example, more moderate ultra-Orthodox Jews are going to say we can work with the secular authorities in it, we can work and to try and get our needs met. And the more extremist groups like Neturei Karta, who I will talk about a little later on, are going to say, no, the state is treif, right? The state is not kosher, right? There will also be questions about possibility of protesting in the diaspora, working with non-Jewish allies. All these things will come into focus and fault lines will be drawn with them. Thirdly, like so many things in Jerusalem, right? This pool is not just about a pool, right? It's a symbol. At this time, this is 1958, right? Jerusalem is a divided city. It's also somewhat of a backwater, right? 1950s Jerusalem was not particularly well developed. And I should say also, I'm talking here about West Jerusalem in this divided city. So I'm not going to say West Jerusalem every single time, but that's what I mean. And it's actually really important to keep in mind that the city is divided. It's a backwater, it's a poor city, it's a religious city. And Gershon Agron, who is a secular mayor, who is affiliated with the Labor Party, right, the dominant secular socialist party, wants to modernize Jerusalem and make it a larger capital city. And at this time, there are actually all sorts of controversies going on. There are controversies about, for example, whether you could have a non-kosher butcher in West Jerusalem, whether there should be a new rabbinic hall, what becomes Heichal Shlomo, built in Jerusalem. Controversies about movie theaters, right? On the larger scene, there are controversies about who is a Jew, right? Do you need to be halakhically Jewish to be labeled as Jewish on your ID card? This comes up with something that's called the Shalit case, right? So it's a year where there's huge questions of Jewish identity and where the state is going. And Agron, and when we think about the pool, it's almost like thinking about stadiums today, right? I feel like talking to Chicago fans is like sort of a difficult topic, but it's something you definitely all know, right? Stadiums have cachet and stadiums mean something. And for a mayor to want a is like Gershon Agron wanting a pool. It's a symbol that they're a modern city. But to do that and to think about why this pool is so important, I want to talk a little bit about the history of bathing. So we'll start here, right? Of course, before we talk about bathing, we have to talk about the beach, right? And going to swimming is a modern pastime. So what do I mean by this? Of course, there's been bodies of water for a long time, but this idea that the beach is something fun and not something dangerous is actually a really modern idea. It's only a couple of hundred years old. It dates back to really the Enlightenment period, and even more so, the idea of leisure time, right? You have to have time to go to the beach. You have to have days off. And additionally, there's this idea that a lot of you are probably familiar with of health benefits, that going to the beach or taking the waters, as it's sometimes called, is good for you. There's even this whole sort of pseudoscience called hydrotherapy, where you take certain numbers of dunks for certain maladies. And what's interesting about the beach, as you can see sort of so perfectly illustrated by this cartoon, is it's both a place where people from different sort of social circles interact, also people of different genders interact, but it's also a place of sort of healing, right? And it very quickly gets this reputation, as it of course still has today, as a place where sort of maybe rules are relaxed a bit. Scholars have this term, I love it, they say the beach is a place of visual intimacy, which means that people are wearing less clothes than they normally do. And so in this space, different kinds of people are matching and mixing and meeting with each other in ways that they never have before. So as soon as you have pools and beaches, right, because it brings together so many different kinds of people, you're going to see attempts to keep people separate, whether that's racial, right? We can talk about the civil rights movement. There's a huge issue of wade-ins and blacks and whites swimming together, but also gender related as well. Keeping, for example, men and women bathing separately. And in fact, I'm not going to talk about it as much today, but this is something that's popular all over Western Europe and to some extent even America as well. And often these ideas of gender and race are linked, right? One of the concerns about men and women swimming together is that, at least in America, Black men, there's a fear, right, from white people, right, that Black men will use this as a way to meet white women. So it's always important to remember that in all these concerns of mixing and gender, that you can never really fully separate out these different issues. Yay, Margate. Yeah, is someone from there? Great. So this is Margate, England, not Margate, New Jersey, but we'll let it slide. I should mention that. Okay, so, right, and these pools and the swimming is coded as modern, right? Here you see this swimming poster for a swimming championship from 1943. And you can see, right, a lot of you, and we spoke about this last week, this idea of the old Jew and the new Jew, right? And swimming, this is a perfect new Jew, swimming in the water, being strong, as it contrasted to the sort of the old Jew of modernity who was physically weak and sort of hunched over. So when we say that Gershon Agron wanted a public swimming pool in Jerusalem, it's because he wanted to make Jerusalem this modern capital city, right? And for the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem, it symbolized a desire to change the makeup of the city entirely, right? To change its religious character and to erase any sort of holy sort of way of being in the city itself. So I want to go just sort of back to the pool and sort of go through the story as it unfolded. So as I said, in 1957, Gershon Agron, the mayor, proposes to city council this plan to build a pool. At the time, there are only 2 pools in Jerusalem, private pools. One pool is located at what Israelis hilariously call Yimka, or the YMCA. And I can talk about it more sort of in the Q&A, but for a lot of reasons, This is generally, or Yimka is generally seen as a sort of private non-Jewish space, as the name suggests, right? It's run by Christians. And although sometimes Jewish people will go, it's not really a part of Jewish Jerusalem per se. The other pool is at a fancy hotel called the President's Hotel, which was supposed to be one of the nicest hotels in the Jerusalem, and sort of a place to see and be seen. So Agron is friends with the owner of the President's Hotel, fascinating man named Chaim Schiff, and they talk. And basically, Agron and Schiff come up with this proposal. I would argue is the first private-public partnership in Jerusalem history, and says, hey, Chaim Schiff, you like running, why don't you run a pool for me? But we'll make this a public pool. We'll make this one for Jerusalem. I also want to point out that this is 1958. It is before air conditioning. Israel is hot, and Tel Aviv is far away, right? You think the you think the bus ride to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the closest beach is like not pleasant now. Imagine it, 60 years ago. It's not always nice. And again, it's a symbol of modernity. It's a symbol of making it. The plan was that the pool would be in the German colony. Again, this is a divided city, so this is really in the outskirts of the city. Unlike today, when Baka is extremely popular, the German colony there was not a ton going on. It was seen as sort of far away from the center of the city, and especially the religious neighborhoods. Again, the city council is divided. There's a huge debates that come out. I'm not going to go through every single protest and every single sort of discussion because we'd be here all night, but I want to highlight some of the big things that come up. So the first people to come out against this pool are Neturei Karta. So Neturei Karta is a name that probably many of you are familiar with. It means guardians of the city in Aramaic. They're generally considered the most extreme anti-Zionist group, and they are purist. They condemn all attempts to negotiate with the state. And so very quickly, sort of almost immediately, they are agitating against the pool. They are, for example, putting out pamphlets in English, right? That's why this is in English, because this is for tourists, saying that we don't want this to happen. 1958, Israel is also gearing up for its 10th Yom HaAtzmaut celebration, right? So they very much do not want to be embarrassed by protests or other sort of unrest. Neturei Karta knows this, and they are hoping to cause some unrest. So I have the text on one side. I didn't type it all up, but I sort of hit the highlights. This is a fascinating document. Just to say, this comes from an amazing collection from the National Library of Israel. It's called the Patchqvillain collection. Patchqvillain is like a wall poster. It is a sort of mode of communication around Jerusalem. You've probably seen them if you've been there and in other cities. And they have an amazing online collection of Patchqvillain in which you can search by source and year and topic, so you can pull up like elections or that sort of thing. It's a fascinating collection. It was donated by actually an extreme anti-Zionist who had collected tens and thousands of them to the state library. So again, yet another contradiction sort of going on in Israel today. So in January, right? So think Chaim Schiff proposes this plan in the fall. In January, Neturei Karta meets and they decide what to do about this pool. And they reach 3 decisions. 1, they're going to excommunicate Chaim Schiff, right? He's the owner of the pool.
Already knowing all about quality and how to do that, like that's a valuable asset.
Okay. 2, they're going to excommunicate everyone involved with the construction of the pool. And 3, they're going to continue their excommunication of the Zionist municipality. Okay, all right, the city government of Jerusalem. And starting after this January decision, Neturei Karta starts to protest every couple of months, really every month or so. These protests, it's anywhere between a couple of dozen people to several thousand people. Sometimes they protest with other ultra-Orthodox groups like Eda Haredit. Sometimes they protest alone. Again, I can't talk about every single one today. I could be here for a long time, but I want to talk about sort of the first one because it will give us a sense of how things develop. So the first one is in February of 1958. A couple hundred people march in Jerusalem. They march, if you can imagine, Mea Shearim, probably some of you are familiar with it. All the protests start in Kikar Shabbat, and they march down, I think that's Strauss Street, into the center of Jerusalem. And when they reach sort of downtown Jerusalem, where King George Street is today, that is when police disperse them, because that is when they tend to start blocking traffic. This is a kind of new wave of behavior for ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. Protests previously were sort of seen as, for lack of a better term, people saying pasnish, not really appropriate. This is the sort of beginning or middle of a wave of public protests by the ultra-Orthodox community, and especially in the sort of more extreme elements, in I would say, a pretty modern way to protest against the state. This protest is illegal by design. This is important. They don't get permits, right? And this is because these people are purists, right? You can't be against the state if you get permits from the state, right? This also means that these are much more likely to result in arrests and publicity, right? Because if you get a permit and the police tell you where to go, they say, walk down this street and they've blocked it off, right? It probably means, right, that there's not going to be as many arrests, right? But if you have an illegal protest and you know that the second you block traffic downtown, the police are going to feel that they need to break up the protest, you will get the injuries, you will get the violence that leads to publicity. There are also often at this time, I would say, huge discussions in the Israeli press about police brutality. Are the Israeli police especially biased against ultra-Orthodox Jews? It's a huge conversation at the time, and just interesting to think about given the events of this week in America. These protesters, they get arrested time and time again. It's the same sort of group of people. Sometimes they serve jail sentences, sometimes they don't, sometimes they get fined, but it's usually not anything more than a month or two or sort of medium level fines. The second thing that they do, in addition to these illegal protests, is what I would call ritualization. There is a desire to make these protests sort of seem like religious gatherings. And this becomes a rhetorical claim, right? Because they're going to say this is not about politics. Our opposition to the pool comes from the fact that we are Orthodox Jews, that we are religious Jews. And this comes from our piety. So this shows up because depending on the time of year, you will see references to upcoming holidays. You will see lines from biblical stories. They're at these protests, there are often Tehillim, Psalms recited. So it feels like a religious event. And I want to show you my favorite example of that. And this is from a protest that happened near Purim. So most of you probably know Shoshanat Yaakov, right? The song that we sing at the end of the Megillah reading. Here is the Neturei Karta version of Shoshanat Yaakov. This is my translation on the side. So it takes the sort of Agron, Shif, and Nam. These are, so Agron is the mayor, Shif is the, as we said, the businessman, Nam is a police chief. When they say blessed Rabbi Amram Haju, that's Amram Blau, the leader of Neturei Karta. And then again, they name check more Zionist police officers. So when they do this, this is not just to like make themselves sort of feel pious or whatnot, it's to insert themselves into Jewish history, right? By Neturei Karta protesting against the pool, they are just like Amram, Mordechai, right? Mordechai protesting against an evil government, saving the Jewish people from destruction. This is a picture of Amram Blau protesting. He is second from the right. They are wearing sackcloth and ashes, right? That's a sort of weird looking outfits. Again, these biblical metaphors that not get a lot of attention, right? That's definitely part of it, but also again, insert themselves into this large sort of Jewish history of fighting for what's right and, fighting against persecution. When I was researching this, I actually read Amram Blau's memoirs, fascinating book. And in it, they ask him, why did you do this, right? Why did you protest the pool? And this is what he says, and this is my translation. If the situation were different, we Jews and them, the Polish, here he uses Polish as a stand-in for sort of all non-Jews. It's another conversation, but it's interesting. If the Polish made a pool for themselves, it wouldn't matter to us. But when all the residents are Jewish and they build a pool that brings tumults of filth and provocation, young men and women run there, and eventually happens that only the chassid is the one who doesn't go to the pool. See for yourselves how residents and public are seen, men and women together in a pool, and the resulting anarchy and disgust. What does the community do? Nothing. But when we fight and publicize it, people pay attention, right? So this is important because here, this is not just about all of Jerusalem. Neturei Karta is also shaming other ultra-Orthodox members or sort of residents of Jerusalem and political organizations and taunting them, saying, why aren't you doing anything? And this makes sort of a special sense when we remember this is a small group of people, not more than 20 or 30 families. Again, they get a lot of attention and they have some support, but this is not the majority of ultra-Orthodox Jews, even in Jerusalem. And in Blau's argument, right, you hear two things. You hear that the pool is going to harm Jerusalem's holiness, right? One of the popular anti-pool slogans is Jerusalem, don't let Jerusalem be a second Paris, right? Why make swimming automatically makes Jerusalem a second Paris? It's another discussion, but it's an interesting choice. And secondly, the pool, and especially this mixed swimming at the pool, is going to offend the Orthodox citizens of Jerusalem who wanted to live there and sacrificed quite a lot to live in what they considered a holy city. But among the ultra-Orthodox Jews who fought the pool, the Haredi Jews, they couldn't quite figure out their message, right? Was this a fight against Zionism, as Neturei Karta would like to have it? Was this a fight just about the pool and the nature of Jerusalem, right? And this is going to be a constant point of conflict, right? How wide should this battle be? How symbolic should it become? So that's Neturei Karta. I want to shift to the municipality, right? How did the municipality respond, right? What did they think? This took the mayor completely by surprise. They didn't think this would happen. They thought they had covered themselves. The pool was far away from religious neighborhoods. And they really thought, okay, they don't have to go there. Why is this such a big deal? But once they realize, right, that this is controversial, the defense shifts, and Agron realizes that he has a political opportunity here. So it stops being public health benefit, Jerusalem as a modern city, but a symbol of religious secular struggle, right? And he says this, he says, I want to avoid this, but they picked this fight and I'm not going to let them win. He actually says, Agron, in a letter to Haaretz in February of that year, we see here the beginning of a struggle that all of us want to prevent, a Kulturkampf. However, the religious are said to force the issue on us. This is a warning to take the matter seriously. I like that line because even in 1958, this is something people were joking about, a swimming pool. The matter is liable to destroy Jerusalem. It does not matter to them, i.e. religious Jews. Perhaps it is their will to remain alone in Jerusalem. They are ready to sanctify a holy war. Here he uses the term milchamet mitzvah, not based on holiness, but on coercion, right? So what he's saying is they aren't claiming religiosity. They pretend this is about, piety, but really it's about control. And me, the secular mayor, I'm gonna save this city from these people. And that's what the battle becomes. Now, of course, there's no firm dividing line between what's religion and what's politics, right? They blend together, and you know, as a scholar, I would say we can't really separate them. But in the debate about the pool, each side is going to say, you're playing religion, no, you're playing politics, no, you're playing religion, and you're playing politics, right? So it's interesting to see how they both use these debates to both claim sort of religious piety and say that the other side is the side that's playing dirty politics. So for the rest of the religious world, and here I'm including the religious Zionist world as well, because Neturei Karta is the first to come out against the pool, it's tainted. There's discomfort about being involved. There's a religious Zionist politician, Isaac Raphael, an important figure in religious Zionism. He's asked about this in a speech in London, and he says, although every Orthodox Jew feels deeply concerned about mixed pools, it must be realized that this is just one facet of much wider religious problems in Israel, which must be tackled with patience and understanding in order not to exacerbate the relationships between the two sections of the population and avoid a kultur kampf, right? So that same word of a cultural battle. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying we have to pick our battles. He's saying, I don't like this. But in a country where there's so many other things going on, this is not the battle I'm going to pick. And even for groups that are somewhat more sympathetic, and here I'm going to talk about Agudat Yisrael for a second, I'll say who they are, they struggle with finding their message. So, as I mentioned earlier, most Haredi Jews in Israel are of this sort of accommodationist way of mind. Sometimes when I'm talking to my students, I'll say, if you can't beat them, join them. And they work within the system, the Israeli Zionist system, without openly supporting Zionism. At this time, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem is a member of Agudat Yisrael, Moshe Porush. The Porushes are a huge, very important political dynasty of Haredi Jews in Israel. There are still Porushes in the Knesset. He is actually anti these protests. He sees them as pasnished. They're not appropriate. He says we should do things, and by we, I guess he means Haredi Jews, behind the scenes. I'll block measures in city council. I'll meet with people. But these protests, they're not helping the cause. However, as time and time goes on, and the Porushes even met with David Ben-Gurion about this issue, he refuses to get involved, they start to feel that they've run out of options. Their attempts to block this at city council aren't getting anywhere. They even tried to buy out Schiff from the pool, but they didn't have any money. So they weren't able to actually get a loan to buy out, and become owners of the pool, or partial owners. And what's also interesting is that the Aguda actually lobbies for the removal of the Kosher certificate from Schiff's hotel. One second. Which is a huge financial blow. As far as I can tell, this is the first overtly political removal of a Kosher certificate in Israeli history. So just to remind ourselves, Schiff owns a very fancy pool, our hotel, which also has a pool. It's the fanciest pool in hotel in Jerusalem. And the Aguda basically gets his Kosher certificate taken away. And with that, he of course loses a lot of business. And an interesting story, in order to get the Kosher certificate back, Schiff actually does sell his shares in the pool, but he doesn't sell them to the Aguda, he sells them to a kibbutz, which sort of runs operations of the pool. But at this point, this is sort of March here, the Aguda feels that they've run out of steam and they're running out of options. And so Moses Porush talks about in his memoir how he felt that there was a need to do something different. And he felt that it was time for an Aguda protest. And he has this sort of great story in his memoirs where he visits the Brisker Rav, Isaac Lev Soloveitchik, to ask for approval for a protest. Each time, it's this very rabbinic story. The Brisker Rav just doesn't answer, so that's meant as a no. It's very Brisker. You know anything about Brisker? But eventually he approves. And there's this massive Aguda protest in June of 1958. It is different because it is organized, it is coordinated with the Israeli government, and there are no speeches. It's only, they release a statement beforehand talking about the sanctity of Jerusalem. So less about attacks against, the Zionist sort of state. And they do this to be the opposite of Neturei Karta. Neturei Karta is loud and unorganized and violent. And they say, no, we are seemly, we do this properly. We do this, in a way that is befitting the dignity of ultra-Orthodox Jews. There's actually, for those of you who know Howard Sacker, who is an American Jewish historian, he has a book called Aliyah, A History of the Peoples of Israel. He actually has about 5 or 6 pages about this protest, a first-hand account. I highly recommend that you read it and look into it. As I mentioned, there are also international activists against the pool. This is probably my favorite document that I have found. One of the partial landowners where the pool was to be built was the Church of England, right? It's Jerusalem. Churches own a lot of different parts of land. In a really interesting move, the Agudas Yisrael of England decides to approach the Church of England, right, to see if they can stop interacting with this, so stop the pool, stop it from happening. There are reports in the Church of England archives, which I found actually an entire file about this, where they go in and they, the rabbis, it's actually very funny because it's just so British from the Church of English perspective. They talk about being very confused that there are all these rabbis showing up without meetings. This is emphasized actually many times, that they show out without meetings. And the Archbishop of Canterbury actually writes to the Archbishop of Jerusalem and says, what do we do, right? Because they don't know what's going on, right? They don't know what to do. And I've typed up the text on the side just so it's easier to read. I just want to point out the Archbishop of Jerusalem is, of course, in Jordan, because again, this is a divided city. And he says, what do we do here? What should I do with these Orthodox Jews who are demanding that I do something about a pool in Jerusalem? And I think what is, probably the most British line, he says, I heard something of the matter. And he says, I think we perhaps leave them to fight it out. Okay, I'm not going to get involved, right? Let these sort of, crazy extremists do their own things. But this attempt to get non-Jews involved is hugely controversial. And I found out about this because in the Haredi press at the time, there are all these discussions and letters to the editor and op-eds that, for debating about whether this was okay or not, right? Can you approach the non-Jews? Can they help? Can they not help, etc.? There are ads taken out in the New York Times against this pool. As I mentioned, there's a protest at the White House by this pool. And because of time, I'm not going to talk about it so much tonight, but American Jews especially, and English Jews also, are disgusted that Orthodox Jews are protesting the state of Israel. In 1958, during the Eisenhower administration, an administration that is seen as, not, quote, pro-Israel, although they didn't use that term then, and they really were worried that this would damage American Jews. Remember, this is 1958. Orthodox Jews do not have the same public presence that they do now. And we, of course, still have those debates then. One of my favorite things that comes out of this is that the New York Times article that covers the protest at the White House, which was in June of 1958, says that the Satmar Rebbe Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, is from Williamsburg, Virginia, right? It's hard to, instead of Williamsburg, New York, it's hard to imagine the Times making that mistake now. And I just want to read you a quote where Neturei Karta explains why they protested at the White House, right? We have symbolically invoked the moral prestige of the United States, whose benevolent influence and good example might dissuade the leaders of the state of Israel from their battle against religion. Certainly, there can be no official interference in another country's internal affairs, but a friendly word of counsel from an old and tried statesman could do much to soothe a troubled state of affairs. The same practice is followed by national groups and minorities and is a daily occurrence, right? So that's Neturei Karta explaining why they, protested at the White House. So they say, this is an act of solidarity, and it's actually ultimately the most American thing to do, right? It's a fascinating statement. So, as I said, the pool opens, right? Nothing they do helps. Gershon is dead set on making this happen, and sort of the non-ultra-Orthodox residents of Jerusalem are pretty frustrated, right, against this attempt to sort of ban mixed swimming from their city. Right after it opens, Neturei Karta proclaimed this pulsa denora, this Kabbalistic death curse on Gershon Agron. It's this whole huge ceremony. It involves shofars, putting out black candles. The pulsa denora is definitely a modern invention. It's not actually ancient, although it's sort of thought of as ancient, but it's this huge public thing. You may have heard of it because it's also been used for other Israeli politicians who displease ultra-Orthodox Jews, most notably for Yitzhak Rabin and also Ariel Sharon. About a year later, Gershon Agron dies. He's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He actually dies very quickly afterwards. And you see these Patchqvillain, these wall posters, right, on the streets of Jerusalem, right? It's pretty dark, right? You can see the text here saying that, we may have lost this battle, but we're going to win the war, right? If I was going to sort of translate this text into thinking about their strategy, we have God on our side, even though we've lost this. The protests do continue for a couple of months after the pool is open, but it's hugely popular, right? Thousands and thousands of people come. They have to turn away people all the time. It's one of the few Olympic-sized pools in the entire country. Here's a picture from 1974, right? It's packed, unsurprisingly. And the question is, and this is what I want to end with, and then I'll be happy to take some questions, is what happens to the pool? What dooms the pool in the end? And in the 50 or so years that the pool operates, and again, this is something that a lot of you probably know very well, Emek Rephaim and the German colony transform. They're no longer the sort of out of the way edge of the city, but a lively, wealthy, popular neighborhood. And the value of real estate goes up and goes up and goes up. And for years and years and years, there have been fights about this pool. And finally, in 2017, the city sells pool to a developer. They promise that they will open another version of the pool in some way when there are new apartments or whatnot. That remains still to be debated. But I just loved this headline from an Israeli paper talking about the pool closing, right? So Grimat Hayam Shel Yerushalayim, closing Jerusalem's ocean. This pool, which was really beloved by a lot of Jerusalem secular residents, it was seen as a huge blow in terms of an old Jerusalem, a Jerusalem that wasn't just for the wealthy, a sort of more secular Jerusalem. There are quotes like, you can see in the caption, right? It's like the Kotel, it's like the Western Wall. Again, all this religious imagery is really interesting for me. They interviewed Moshe Gertel, who was an older man who swam every morning. He's like, it's like they're taking away my limbs. Right? Again, this really intense feelings and longings about a pool and what it would stand for. So rather than sort of religion versus politics, I think it's actually more helpful to think about the pool as how do we express Jewish values in the public sphere, right? How do we think about, what is appropriate, what is not, right? So should a Jewish state observe Shabbat? Should a Jewish state observe modesty in the public sphere? And who gets to decide that? And especially when we think about Jerusalem, what is the image of Jerusalem, not just for Israelis, but for the world around? Because as I alluded, this becomes one of the ways in which ultra-Orthodox Jews around the world start to pay more and more attention about what's going on in Israel and start to get more and more involved in Israeli politics as well. But I think that is a talk for another time. I will stop there, and I'm more than happy to take questions or comments. Feel free.
So I'll pose an opening question. Curious as to how this translates to whether at the time or subsequent to separate sex beaches in Tel Aviv and the politics around beaches, more specifically.
Yeah, so this is the other half of my book. So I'm glad you asked about it. So the thing that's really interesting to me is about the same time as this, a little bit later, there's going to be attempts to make gender segregated beaches. The first one is in Tel Aviv. It opens in 1966. And what's interesting to me is you see these two separate strategies. The first strategy is what I talked about tonight. And that's saying we need going sort of against the grain, right? We need Jerusalem to not have any mixed swimming, right? We need to create the standard. And that actually doesn't work. It fails. And the protests are very good for, I would say, riling up the base. You have in this massive protest that I mentioned by the Aguda, you have anywhere between 20 and 40,000 people show up in a protest in Jerusalem in 1958, when there's probably about 160,000 people who live in Western Jerusalem, right? So these are huge, huge numbers, but they don't work. What does work, and this is what's really interesting to me, is what happens in Tel Aviv. And what happens in Tel Aviv is that the same political party, Agudat Yisrael, asks for an exception for the rule. They'll say, give us a little corner of our own beach, right? In an ideal world, there would be separate swimming for the entire beach, but that's not realistic. That actually was the rule in Tel Aviv at one point, although it was never really observed. And that's possible. It's something that resonates. It's something that has a lot of sympathy. And this gender segregated beach is the first space outside of a sort of Beit Knesset, a synagogue, that has gender segregation. And I would argue that while one can make a logical, or I should say a moral distinction, let's say between a separate bus, for example, and a separate beach, they use actually really similar logic. And that's what's interesting to me. Legally, they are different and they're different under Israeli law, but this idea of a special exception for us to be able to relive our religious life comes from the failures of the Jerusalem swimming pool, I would argue.
How so?
Because they learn what not to do. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's good for getting people to march. It's good for, but it doesn't work. What does work is saying, give us a space that's for our own. Give us a space that works just for us. We're not forcing our values. Again, I'm mimicking the language of the Haredi politicians. We're not forcing our values on you, right? We just want something so we can also go to the beach just like anyone else. I saw there was a question about what's there now. I'll get to you next. The last time I was in Jerusalem, it was still a construction site. I'm not sure what the last thing is. I'm not sure what it is right now. Like many construction projects, these take years and years and years, but the pool has not been open for a couple of years. Yeah, you had a question, Jean?
Yes, I was in Israel in 1959 in the summer, and every day in the paper there was another thing about the pool. They wanted it segregated. They had it closed most of the time. We never got to use it. whether we were integrated or separated. But it was really interesting. And I still remember all the discussions about it.
Oh, thank you.
So
I'm so
this-
glad. Thank you so much for sharing.
Right, this was a year later and they were still dealing with it.
Yeah, for those of you who know, now I am blanking on her name, the philosopher, the Jewish feminist philosopher who wrote Expanding the Palace of Torah. She told me that she was at Hebrew U. She was in college that year, and the Purim spiel at like the university was all about the pool, with like this very crude Purim spiel of like dressed up as Haredim, but also wearing bathing suits. Tamar Ross, thank you. And she told me all these really funny stories. But yeah, it was still going on, and it was something that remained to be controversial even when it was open. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I also wanted to ask whether the politics were contained to local politics or whether it took on any national overtones. And there seems to be a little bit of maybe internal inconsistency where the state has this religious character, as you were saying at the beginning, right? The country feels, there feels like there is a degree of Jewish observance on Shabbat, the public buses, etc. So to some extent, the state has incorporated and is a religious state, and yet here's a local instance of the government in the most holy city fighting the religious community. And did that have any sort of national reverberations or involvement?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that comes up is a lot of people say, well, is it, to the religious parties or the religious opponents of the pool, mixed swimming is mixed swimming no matter where you are. If it's Asur, right? If it's forbidden in Jerusalem, it's forbidden in Tel Aviv, it's forbidden in Haifa, right? And there actually were attempts to make a big deal about mixed swimming, mainly on behalf of Torah Karta in Ramat Gan, but it didn't really catch because, like, who cares about a pool in Ramat Gan? Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem is what makes this sort of catch and what transcends this from a local political issue to a national and even international issue. Because what happens in Jerusalem never really stays local. I think it's Yehuda Amichai, right, who writes beautifully about Yerushalayim Shel Mala and Yerushalayim Shel Mata, right? The sort of everyday Jerusalem and the sort of heavenly Jerusalem, right? It's his poem, Atzuv Liot Roshei Yerushalayim. Like, it's so sad to be the mayor of Jerusalem because, like, how do you even begin? And I think this was such a perfect example of that because you have something that's really sort of local and it just can't stay local. Everyone has an opinion and everyone feels like they have a stake, right? Not just Israelis, right? But Jews all around the world feel like they can dictate what happens and what goes on in Jerusalem.
Even non-Jews.
Even non-Jews as well.
As we saw with the Archbishop.
Exactly. Although he is very much like, I'm not, but they think, right? But this is really interesting, even though the Archbishop doesn't want to be involved at all, right? In the minds of these Haredi Jews, they think this is so important that everyone must care, right? They misjudge. Obviously, the Archbishop of Jerusalem does not care, right? But it says something really interesting about the mindset which these people are acting.
Fascinating.
Isn't the current mayor of Jerusalem religious? The mayor now is religious, Moshe Leon, but it happened, I would say, I think this has very little to do with the pool and much more to do with money, to be honest. It's a lot to do with money. I'm sure the city made a ton of money. There had been attempts for years to close it. I do not think he had become the mayor yet when it was sold. I think it was still Nir Barkat, who was a secular person, but many people critique her for being too religiously, I don't know, whatever, not standing up to the Haredim enough. But that's, again, a topic for another discussion. Again, I just want to thank you all so much. I want to thank Mike and Elliot and Ravari, who's not here, for making this happen. It was lovely. I hope I can visit in person soon.
Thank you very much. It's really fascinating. Hopefully have you as a guest in person.
Yes, thank you. So have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.